South Africa's extreme poverty and inequality is well known and it's well documented. A toxic mix of high unemployment and low wages for the majority of workers perpetuates this crisis. So it would seem that massive job creation and increased wage levels will go a long way to defeating poverty. And last year's discussions were initiated at NEDLAC about the need for a minimum wage across all sectors. We'll find out what has happened since then as we're joined by Professor Lucien from Walt from the Department of Sociology at Rhodes University. This is Workers on Wednesday. Taking your views as well on 0891 104 207. SMS is on 34701. We'll be joined a little later by Mr. Trenton, Elsley, Director with Labour Research Service. But we'll start our conversation with you, Professor. Good morning to you. Thank you for joining us and welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
Now, what has happened since last year's discussions at NEDLAC about the need for a minimum wage across all sectors?
Well, what's happened is it's been overtaken by a number of arguments, a number of pressures by the big companies that higher wages are going to be unsustainable. This has come alongside a series of threats around retrenchment. We've seen this in mining, we've seen this in steel. So in that context, a lot of the debate has simply stalled, or it's been overtaken by the claim that high wages are going to lead to job loss.
And your views, would high wages lead to job losses? Are they unsustainable?
It's a bit of a tricky one. I think you need to understand the South African economy is essentially based on low wages. It's a low-wage, high unemployment model, and it's an economy with deep structural problems. It's not that competitive. It's based on very skewed investment patterns. For example, we've got lots of shopping malls. We've got pretty appalling living conditions for most people. However, I think there's more wiggle room for higher wages than people are often willing to admit. If you look at the salaries a lot of executives are putting down, if we simply did something like cap some of those top salaries, it would be possible to improve wages for people below. I think the big AMCU strike on the mines also showed, and a lot of the research that came out, they also showed that the mines were able, even before the strike, to afford the wage that they claimed was completely impossible.
All right, and we are joined now by Mr. Trenton Elsley, Director with Labour Research Service. Good morning to you too, Mr. Elsley. Thank you very much for being a part of this discussion and this conversation. Just talking about higher wages in South Africa, some companies saying that they're unsustainable. I'd like your views on this, and also if you could give us a sense of poverty and inequality in South Africa with the income gap.
Good morning, Rhodes. Thanks for having me. Parachuted in. I think it sounded like Lucien was talking about wages at the top of the ladder. Our research suggests, ratios of 321 on executive remuneration, compared to your average worker. That's just remuneration. What's not included in there is long-term incentives, which is things like share options, which is where the real money is in executive pay. So, the real number I would suggest is a lot higher than 320 to 1. So very skewed. If you look lower down the ladder, and you find last time I checked, average wages in this country were something like a little over 13,000 rand a month. Now, generally you would hope that the average was representative, of it. But that's not the case in South Africa, because you'll find that wages, which is, the wage in the middle, if you line up all the wages in the country, the one in the middle, so in other words, half of people earn less than that amount and half of people earn that amount or more, and that number is more like 3,000 rand a month, which suggests that, it's well known, we have a highly skewed distribution of income in this country. So you must understand then that, wages are set at 2,000 rand and lower for half of people out there. Now, that is a very small amount, and I would suggest that 3,000 rand, yes, most people can you survive on 3,000 rand a month? And if they're honest with you, they'll say, absolutely not, that would be a disaster. And I think it is a disaster.
Now let's elaborate on the skewed distribution of income, as you put it, Mr. Elsley. And Professor, maybe talk about the real-life consequences of this, the real-life consequences of having such a huge income gap between the executives and the workers on the lower rungs of the ladder.
All right. The problem when we talk about average wages, we're putting into one pot the wages at the top and the wages at the bottom, which is why South Africa has got a high per capita income, although most people live in poverty. Now, if we start to look at the lives of ordinary people, you've got to understand with mines, for example, median wage is still around 6,000, manufacturing it's under 4,000. Now, people in the working class broadly are facing a whole range of pressures. There's escalating costs. Some of those are around food. As we know, the maize price, for example, is going up, but food prices have been escalating for more than 20 years. There's other costs that people are expected to pay, for example, with the introduction of prepaid meters for electricity. There's an additional cost, and when you add to that Eskom raising costs elsewhere. Put into this mix the apartheid geography that we still have, the huge transport costs people have got to come into town to go buy a few things. I think you can see a situation where people are under immense pressure. So South Africa is a breeding ground for all sorts of conflict, tension, and misery. This is the context in which, for example, you get violence against foreigners a while back. People are really, really struggling. And for most people, you can live in South Africa and live and go to your Sandton malls, and there's that South Africa. But for most people, South Africa is a pretty grim place to live.
Wow. Grim picture that's been painted, and we will talk more about the issue of a minimum wage versus a living wage and get the distinction between those two phenomena. It's 13 minutes after 10.
ANN 7 SAFm 2015 brings you US singing superstar Christina Aguilera alongside international pop sensation Jason Derulo and many top South African artists on 17th October 2015 at Ticket Pro Dome, Johannesburg. Tickets will be available from Monday 24th August at ticketpro.co.za.
A strong girl is a woman or girl who knows the full potential and creates positive change in her community. This Women's Month, SABC and One Africa are searching for one strong girl to join us in New York during the UN General Assembly in September. If you know a strong girl, nominate her. SMS strong girl and her name and contact number to 34766. Entries close September 4th. T's and C's apply. SMSs cost R1. Free SMSs do not apply. Brought to you by SABC and the One Campaign.
This is your 8 p.m. on SABC2 this week. Monday, lying is a sin. These pretty little liars are already experiencing hell. Tuesday, marriage, divorce, and everything in between on All of Us, followed by Dream School. Wednesday, some more comedy on Love That Girl, then Dream School thereafter. Thursday, the Jamie Foxx Show keeps us laughing, followed by La Familia. And on Friday, we take a chance on our knowledge of music on Music Roulette. 8 p.m. is perfect for the whole family on SABC2.
The Premier of KwaZulu-Natal, Mr. Senzo Mchunu, cordially invites all small-scale mining enterprises to the small-scale Imbizo, which will be led by Minister of Mineral Resources, Advocate Ngwako Ramatlhodi. The Imbizo takes place at Eskaleni TVET College on the 27th and 28th of August. The aim of the Imbizo is to assist small-scale mining enterprises resolve challenges they face in the industry. Advocate Ramatlhodi will be accompanied by Minister of Small Business Development, Ms. Lindy Zulu, and Ms. Lynn Brown, Minister of Public Enterprises.
Great stories told by great personalities. SAFm, South Africa's news and information leader.
And this is Workers on Wednesday. We continue talking about a minimum wage versus the living wage in South Africa. We'll just get a quick distinction between the two in a short while. And our guest, Professor Lucien van der Walt from the Department of Sociology at Rhodes University, and Mr. Trenton Elsley, Director with Labour Research Services. Mr. Elsley, maybe give us the distinction between a minimum wage versus the living wage, and what should trade unions be campaigning for?
Okay, two separate parts to the question. Simply put, minimum wage is an effort to set a kind of wage floor, below which nobody should earn. So it really is quite a minimal concept. A living wage, on the other hand, quite different in that it is supposed to be the idea of an income, a wage income that supports a life that is something more than surviving. as implied by the name, a living wage. It should link to a notion of a decent life.
And should a minimum wage not be a living wage? I mean...
Well, I think what you have there is an ideal. I mean, I think that would be great. If the minimum wage was a decent wage, we would have arrived somewhere socio-economically. We're not in that place. The second part of your question was, what should trade unions be campaigning for? Look, it's a tricky one. I think if we look around, let's take a moment. I think a lot of people, when the 12,500 call was coming out of the London strike, I think a lot of people, gosh, that's unreasonable. They're mad. 12,500. The thing is, as you pointed out earlier on, it turned out that the company, could afford it, which is something that a lot of people also would not have believed. Work I've done is also suggesting that a living wage, a wage that you could associate with a decent standard of living. Some of this work in its early stages is suggesting an amount of over 10,000 Rand a month. So I think it's really important to know where we would like to go, because there's a terrible irony in that we know quite a lot about wealth, we know quite a lot about poverty, but we have quite a vague picture, I think, in South African society of what is it to live a decent life. Not an extravagant life, but a decent life. So I think it's really important that we start to get closer to the picture of where do we want the mass of people in South Africa to be situated? What kind of life? We talk about political rhetoric of a better life for all. What does that better life look like? And I think we're getting a bit closer. So, I would suggest that a minimum wage would have to be at least 3,000 Rand to have any real meaning. From a worker perspective, ideally it would be higher. We had a group of about 100 people together recently, diverse group, different federations, different unions, some unemployed people, and we had a ballot. We asked them what they thought how much a national minimum wage should be, and the winning number in the end was 5,000. So I'm just sharing that with you.
5,000 and 3,000.
100,000 a month.
Okay, we'll explore this a lot further, because I'd like to know what the challenges are that are faced by trade unions, for instance, in getting a decent wage for workers. But you'll respond on that, Professor, in a short while. Let's first go to James in Witbank. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. Please, a living wage, does it include the cell phone? Does it include DSTV? And does it include the car and all these things? Thank you. I listen on the radio.
All right. Well, does it? Mr. Elsley?
Look, I'll pick up on one example. I think the caller hasn't really made their question, I think the underlying part of their question, well, I don't want to guess, but I think there is a tendency they think that people are irresponsible. If you give them more money, they'll buy all the wrong things. In other words, they'll waste their money. But it's really quite an arrogant position. And I think what we're talking about is people do make a lot of rational decisions. And I think if people have more money, they generally will spend it on things that will improve their quality of life. And just to take one example, cell phones. Cell phones are not a luxury. Anybody who thinks that a cell phone is a luxury in this day and age, I think has missed the point entirely. Cell phones are deeply embedded in our social world, in our economic world, and even in our political world. I mean, this is the technology of the day. And I would suggest, that a cell phone is something of a necessity.
And where's the struggle, Professor, for the unions in coming up with a decent wage, a living wage, especially in a year, where we, in mining, for instance, this year, where we saw all the activity, and where do you see this going?
Well, one of the things just to bear in mind here is a living wage is something that will provide people with dignity and justice, and who defines that matters as much as the level that we set it at. So if you really want to define a living wage, this is something that working class people themselves, through their own structures, through their own organizations, need to define. The problem with the minimum wage is it tends to be set by government ministers after consultation with various groups of people. And what I'm saying is it makes more sense if you locate a living wage in a living wage campaign. That is a campaign in which ordinary people through the working class organizations themselves define and discuss and campaign for and enforce a living wage. Now, I don't have any problem with if a living wage is used for people for cell phones or internet or TV. There's no particular reason why the working class should live on the bare bones. That's exactly the problem with the minimum wage. As they currently exist, they're always below a minimum wage, below a living wage. Now, how you would do this, there's several things that would be important. The one, as my colleague has just mentioned, is we need a clear vision of where to go. And I think one of the first things that has to be done, and one of the most important answers to the arguments that this is possible and that's not possible, is we need to fundamentally question the way this economy works. We're essentially in a society that benefits a small political and a small economic elite. And we take that society as our norm, and I think that's a problem. We need to think radically about reallocating resources, about redistributing wealth and power. So the struggle for a living wage has to be tied to a struggle to restructure the economy in a way that gives working class people better incomes, more power over their lives. And the only way to get that is through widespread campaigning. Now, the way to do that in terms of unions is we would need, in a lot of the trade unions, quite a lot of reform, democratization of the unions. We need to move beyond splits that are often driven by personalities, but we'd also need to move mass movements away from the control of political parties. Because a lot of those splits we see in the unions, not least the COSATU split, are driven by political party factions spilling over into the unions. So you need a new vision and a new set of ideas. You need a redistribution of wealth and power. And for this to happen, you need to have a vibrant working class civil society that is autonomous, that is self-managed, and that is aiming at something radically different to what we've got now. We've got to push the envelope. The fact that the society is sick is not an argument to live in a sick society. I think it's an argument to look for a cure.
All right. Taking calls, 0891 104 207. We'll take a call or two. 0891 104 207. If you'd like to comment on the minimum wage and living wage debate. We are also taking SMSs on 34701. You can tweet at SAFm Radio. Now let's talk about the nature of capitalism, which, with increased profits really being reliant on the greater exploitation of workers. Tell us what your response is to critics of the living wage campaign who argue that it will chase away investors, it will cause job losses in the country, and it will lead to even greater poverty. Mr. Elsley?
Well, I mean, these are it's always the same. I think what's often implicit in some of the criticisms of instance of a national minimum wage or even a living wage is that there's this implicit that somehow it's working, and that this national minimum wage, for instance, this is going to break it. It's going to cause trouble. Now, my perspective is that it's not working. This society, this economy is not really working. I think what we have to be a doomsday prophet is we are sitting on something of a social crisis. And we cannot simply say that, this will chase away investment. The thing is that it's not working, and we need to really be bold, I think, and look at it to understand that we need to do something, and to understand that doing nothing is an action. It's a decision. To do nothing can have very powerful consequences. And so we need to be quite bold, I believe, and to acknowledge the crisis that we are sitting on, because the crisis tends to resolve itself. It will develop in its own ways, and in ways that are unpredictable.
All right, Professor Lucien van der Walt saying that we are sitting on a social crisis. What are your views? I'll take quick calls. Desmond in Amanzimdodi, good morning. Please be very brief.
Good morning. I know that I'm now being regulated to talk to you.
Please, can you be very brief, Babu Desmond?
Regulated, yeah.
Okay, I'm not sure what Babu Desmond. Okay, Alex, good morning.
Good
Good morning and good morning to your guest.
Good morning.
Thank you so much. I agree. We do need to really accept the campaign on the living wage and ensure that we have a legislated minimum wage. There are different approaches so far being discussed. Whether we need a legislated minimum wage that cuts across all the economic sectors, or we need to consider sector by sector basis, taking into consideration the characteristics of the sectors and the impact on that very same minimum wage. But I must say that I want to say something about the comments made about the divisions in the trade union movement. I think the guest has elevated subjective factors far above objective factors and realities. The divisions that are occurring in the labor movement have come in the context of a global international crisis of capitalism and, of course, the many frustrations that are facing the workers and the options that are put to the table. So I don't think that the divisions occur simply as a result of differences over politics of political parties. And there are economic factors also within trade union movements. Trade unions are no longer only led by the working class, or individuals who are occupying key positions in trade unions are not necessarily working class elements. There have been so many configurations of the class structure of our society which went as far as the trade union movement. And of course, workers are a market over and above being exploited by capital, and trade unions offer access to those particular markets. So it is important that we take each one of these objective factors into consideration before we reach conclusions as to what are the driving factors of divisions in the union movement. And the last point I would like to make is whether under capitalism really changing the balance between wages and profit will actually reach a point where workers live a better life, because the accumulation regime is based on maximizing profit, and most of the time labor finds itself being restructured by capital, because capital does not have control over the other factors of production.
I'd like to give give our guests an opportunity to respond to and also to wrap up for us. I'll start with you, Mr. Elsley.
Okay, look, I think the broad question is a complex one, and I think the answers, unfortunately, are also complex. I support a national minimum wage at a certain meaningful level. I think that we need some politically unattractive courses of action. I think we need to develop education radically, really upscale it. I think a highly educated population is key, and it won't happen overnight. I think we need committed industrial and economic policy to stimulate higher value-add enterprises to begin to get out of this low value-add path I think that this economy is structured on, and which struggles to create jobs. Very simply, I think we need to strengthen collective bargaining. This is an international experience around national minimum wages, and I think we need to revisit social protection to look at the yawning gap. If you are working age, able-bodied person, and you don't have a job, you are simply adrift in the sea of poverty, and there's no support for you.
And who's running currently, who's driving the living wage campaign? Because trade unions seem to be in crisis as we speak. So who's driving this campaign, just as a final question?
Sorry.
Professor, go ahead, please.
All right. Look, there's a few things here. The one is it's not an either or on the problems in the unions. And of course, South Africa is not an island, and we are affected by a global crisis, and our own economy has a crisis as well.
All right.
Which is exactly why we need to radically shift the path.
Okay, unfortunately that's all we have time for, so we must leave it. They're talking about unemployment, low wages, poverty, all potentially contributing to stress levels in South Africa. In fact, South Africa is ranked as the second most stressed country globally. 1 in 3 South Africans suffer from a mental disorder in their lifetime. We'll talk more about that after the news headlines right now. It's 10:30 and